On a sweltering July afternoon in 1963, the Thompson family pulled into the parking lot of Mason's Diner in Greenwood, Mississippi. James Thompson, his wife Diana, and their three children had been coming to this restaurant every Sunday after church for the past 5 years. The familiar neon OPN sign flickered in the window, and the parking lot was half full with the usual after-church crowd. 12-year-old Michael Thompson's stomach growled as they walked toward the entrance. The smell of fried chicken and fresh biscuits drifted through the air. His younger sisters, Amy and Sarah, skipped ahead, their Sunday dresses swishing in the warm breeze. Diana Thompson smoothed her best church dress, while James adjusted his tie, looking forward to their traditional family meal. But something felt different today. As they approached the glass door, they noticed a new sign, Private Membership Only. James frowned, checking his watch. It was 2:30 p.m., their regular time. Through the window, they could see white families eating at several tables, none showing any kind of membership card. When James pulled the door open, the usual friendly chime of the bell was met with sudden silence. Mary Mason, the owner's wife who had served them countless times before, hurried over with an uncomfortable look on her face. "I'm sorry, we're members only now," she said, not quite meeting their eyes. "New policy. Members only?" James kept his voice steady, though his hand tightened slightly on Michael's shoulder. "Since when? We've been coming here every Sunday for years." Since this morning," Mary stammered, glancing nervously at her husband behind the counter. "Nothing personal, you understand. Just business." Inside the diner, some customers looked down at their plates, while others stared openly. Michael noticed his friend Tommy, who sat with his white family at their usual booth, quickly turn away when their eyes met. Rather than cause a scene, James Thompson guided his family back to their car. Diana's hands trembled slightly as she helped the girls into the back seat. Michael watched his father's face in the rearview mirror, noting how he clenched his jaw, a sign he was holding back anger. They drove to Johnson's family restaurant across town, hoping it was just an isolated incident. But there, a RESDRVED, all TABLES sign greeted them, despite several empty tables visible through the windows. At Pete's Diner, they were told the kitchen had just closed, even as the cook could be seen preparing meals. By the time they tried their fourth restaurant, the message was clear. Something had changed in Greenwood. That evening, the Thompsons' phone started ringing. First, it was the Williams family, their close friends from church, sharing a similar experience at different restaurants. Then the Johnsons called, and the Robertsons, and the Clarks. Each family had been turned away from restaurants they'd frequented for years. Diana Thompson sat at their kitchen table, writing down each family's story in her neat handwriting. James paced the living room, speaking in hushed tones with other community members on the phone. The children sat quietly doing homework, but Michael couldn't focus on his math problems. He kept thinking about Tommy's face in the diner and how quickly his friend had looked away. Later that night, after putting the younger children to bed, James and Diana sat on their front porch. The warm Mississippi night hummed with cicadas as they discussed what to do next. Through their open windows, they could hear their neighbors' phones ringing too, as word spread through Greenwood's black community. "This isn't just about lunch," James said quietly, his deep voice carrying in the still night air. "This is about our dignity, about our children's future." Diana reached for his hand. "We need to do something," she agreed. But what? They didn't know it then, but that Sunday afternoon would mark the beginning of a movement that would change their town forever. As the streetlights flickered on and moths danced in their glow, the Thompsons made a decision. They would not accept this new reality quietly. In homes across Greenwood that night, other families were having the same conversation. The next morning would bring new challenges, but also new determination. The simple act of being refused service at Mason's Diner had lit a spark that would soon grow into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The Monday morning after the restaurant incident started out like any other at Greenwood High School, where Diana Thompson taught English. But there was a heaviness in her steps as she walked through the hallways, her teaching materials clutched tightly to her chest. News had spread fast in their small town. During her lunch break, instead of eating, Diana started making a list. Her colleague, Mary Jenkins, watched as Diana wrote down every restaurant in Greenwood that had turned away black families. The list grew longer with each phone call she received. Mason's Diner, Sunday, July 14, 2:30 p.m., Williams family turned away. Johnson's Family Restaurant, Sunday, July 14, 3:00 p.m., Thompson family denied service. Pete's Diner, Sunday, July 14, 3:45 p.m., Robertson family told kitchen was closed. By the end of the school day, her neat handwriting filled 3 pages of her notebook. 15 families had been turned away from 8 different restaurants. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, across town at the local post office, James Thompson noticed something strange. White customers who usually greeted him with a smile now avoided eye contact. Mrs. Anderson, who had always stopped to chat about her grandchildren, hurried past his window without looking up. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. That afternoon, 12-year-old Michael Thompson experienced his own painful moment at school. During lunch period, he walked toward his usual table where he had sat with Tommy and other friends all year. But as he approached, Tommy looked uncomfortable and mumbled something about the table being full, even though there were empty seats. Michael stood there for a moment, his lunch tray growing heavy in his hands, before walking away to sit alone. The story spread beyond Greenwood's black community. At the local supermarket, Sarah Williams overheard 2 white women whispering about how those troublemakers were trying to ruin good businesses. When Sarah reached for a can of tomatoes, the women moved their shopping carts to a different aisle. By Tuesday evening, the situation had grown more tense. The Greenwood Daily News ran a small article titled "Local Restaurants Implement New Policies," which made no mention of race but quoted restaurant owners talking about maintaining their right to serve who they choose. The article sat next to advertisements for the very same restaurants that had turned families away. That night, a meeting formed naturally at First Baptist Church. People didn't need formal invitations, they just knew to come. The church basement, usually used for Sunday school classes, was packed with familiar faces. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the summer heat and the crowd of worried people. Diana Thompson stood at the front of the room, her list of incidents now grown to 5 pages. As she read each entry out loud, people nodded in recognition or added their own stories. Some spoke of being turned away from restaurants they'd eaten at for decades. Others mentioned how their children were suddenly uninvited from birthday parties at these establishments. "My daughter Jenny cried all night," said Mrs. Clark, her voice shaking. "She doesn't understand why she can't go to her best friend's party at Mason's next week." The room grew quiet as Robert Williams, Marcus's older brother and a Korean War veteran, stood up. Still wearing his mechanic's uniform from work, he spoke with quiet intensity. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I bled for this country, and now I can't even buy a cup of coffee in my hometown." As the meeting continued, people began to realize this wasn't just about being denied service. It was about their children growing up in a town that saw them as less than human. It was about their dignity, their rights, and their future. The meeting ended late that night, but no one seemed eager to leave. Small groups formed in the parking lot, talking in low voices about what to do next. Cars passed by slowly on the street, their headlights sweeping across concerned faces. Inside the church, Diana Thompson added one final note to her growing document. Tuesday, July 16, 1963, first community meeting held. Attendance, 87 people. This is just the beginning. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but one thing was clear. The quiet, peaceful town of Greenwood was about to change forever. The tension had been building like a summer storm, and soon it would break. Marcus Williams stood in front of his bathroom mirror early Wednesday morning, carefully knotting his tie. As a deacon at First Baptist Church for 15 years, he had earned the community's trust. Today, that trust would be more important than ever. He had spent most of the night making phone calls from his kitchen, his wife Emma bringing him cups of coffee as the hours ticked by. They had planned something bigger than just another meeting. This would be the day their community started fighting back, not with fists or angry words, but with organization and dignity. By 9:00 a.m., the church parking lot was already filling up. People had taken days off work, arranged babysitters, and some had driven from neighboring towns after hearing about what was happening in Greenwood. The summer heat was building, but that didn't stop people from coming. Inside the church, Emma Williams and Diana Thompson arranged folding chairs in neat rows. They had borrowed extra chairs from the Methodist church down the street, but even that might not be enough. Diana's list of incidents had grown to 7 pages, and more people kept calling with their stories. "We need to be smart about this," Marcus told Emma as they watched people file in, careful and smart. By 10 o'clock a.m., the church was packed. Over 200 people squeezed into the main hall, with more standing along the walls. The air conditioning couldn't keep up, and church fans with pictures of Jesus waved back and forth across the crowd. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Marcus Williams walked to the front, and the room fell silent. He didn't need to ask for quiet. People were ready to listen. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his deep voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're here today because something has to change. But how we make that change matters just as much as the change itself." He unveiled a large chalkboard that had been covered with a sheet. On it, he had written 3 words: documente, organize, acte. First, Marcus explained, pointing to document, "We need to record everything. Every turned-away family, every rude comment, every broken promise. Mrs. Thompson has already started this work." Diana stood up, holding her notebook. "We need dates, times, and witnesses," she added. "Everything must be written down." Under organize, Marcus wrote several points: block leaders, phone trees, meeting schedule, and fund collection. "We're dividing Greenwood into 12 neighborhoods," he explained. "Each will have a block leader responsible for keeping their area informed and organized. Mrs. Jenkins has agreed to be our treasurer, and we're setting up a special fund at the Black-owned Friendship Bank. Young college students from the local community college, home for the summer, volunteered to be runners, carrying messages between block leaders when needed. Sarah Martinez, who worked as a secretary, offered to type up all of Diana's handwritten notes into proper reports." Then Marcus pointed to active. "This is where we need to be especially smart," he said. "We're not here for revenge. We're here for justice." He explained their plan: peaceful protests outside the restaurants, but only 2 or 3 people at a time, rotating in shifts. They would dress in their Sunday best, stand quietly with signs, and document any responses. They would also start their own directory of which businesses in town still serve Black customers, supporting those who treated everyone fairly. The meeting continued for hours. People shared ideas, signed up for different roles, and contributed what money they could to the fund. Mrs. Wilson, who owned a small printing shop, offered to make their signs for free. Mr. Johnson, a photographer, volunteered to document everything with his camera. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus called everyone to stand. In a tradition familiar to all, they joined hands and sang, "We Shall Overcome." The sound filled the church, spilling out onto the street where curious onlookers had gathered. Before people left, they were each given specific tasks and schedules. Block leaders stayed behind for additional training. The church secretary worked on making copies of contact lists and schedules. "Remember," Marcus said as people headed home, "we're not just doing this for ourselves. We're doing this for our children and their children after them." That evening, as Marcus and Emma Williams finally headed home, they saw something that gave them hope. In different parts of town, porch lights were blinking on and off, the new signal they had agreed upon, meaning, "All is well, we stand together." The movement had begun, and there would be no turning back. By the end of the first week, the Greenwood Equal Rights Coalition's plan was in full motion. Early Thursday morning, Dr. Patricia Robinson, a respected Black dentist, stood quietly outside Mason's diner. She wore her best navy blue suit and held a simple sign that read, "All God's children deserve to eat." Behind her professional smile, Dr. Robinson felt nervous. Just yesterday, she had treated the diner owner's daughter for a toothache. Now, she stood outside their business, making a statement that couldn't be ignored. 2 college students, James Carter and Lucy Washington, sat in a parked car across the street, taking photographs and notes of everything that happened. The response from passing cars was mixed. Some white drivers humped in support, while others shouted angry words. Dr. Robinson remained perfectly still, her sign held high. She had practiced this calm stance in her mirror last night, remembering Marcus Williams' words, "Our dignity is our strongest weapon." Across town, the coalition's other plans were working just as smoothly. Diana Thompson and her team of volunteers had created the Green Book of Greenwood, a small directory listing every business that served all customers fairly. They printed 500 copies on Mrs. Wilson's printing press, and by noon, nearly all were distributed. The phone trees buzzed with activity. Each block leader kept their group of 10 families informed about which restaurants still welcomed black customers. They'd also shared news about which white business owners had quietly expressed support for their cause, even if they weren't ready to say so publicly. At the local college, something unexpected happened. Sarah Martinez's typed reports about the restaurant incidents had made their way to Professor William Hayes, a white history teacher. He read them during his lunch break and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he announced to his American history class, "We're going to study current events." He handed out copies of Sarah's reports to his mostly white students. "This is happening right here, right now, in our town. What does this tell us about history repeating itself?" By Friday afternoon, some of those students joined the peaceful protests. Mary Anderson, whose father owned the largest car dealership in town, stood beside Dr. Robinson with her own sign, "Hate has no home in Greenwood." The local bank president, Mr. George Thompson, no relation to Diana's family, noticed something interesting on his books. Businesses that still served black customers were seeing their profits rise, while those that discriminated were starting to show losses. He mentioned this at his Friday golf game with other business leaders. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams and his team kept detailed records of everything. Each protest was photographed. Every supportive comment and every angry reaction was written down. Mr. Johnson, the photographer, developed the pictures in his home darkroom, creating duplicate copies for safekeeping. The coalition also started what they called the Welcome Campaign. Whenever a business served everyone fairly, customers would thank them specifically for their inclusivity. Mrs. Clark made a point of telling the owner of Parker's grocery store, "We appreciate how you treat all your customers with respect." Word spread about which businesses deserved their support. Young Michael Thompson and his friends found their own way to help. They created maps showing the quickest routes between friendly businesses, sharing them with elderly community members who couldn't walk far. They called it their Safe Path Project. By Saturday, something remarkable happened at Pete's Diner. Pete himself, after seeing his regular customers dwindle and watching the peaceful protesters outside, took down his reserved signs. He served his first black family in years, the Robertsons, who ordered coffee and pie. The coalition made sure to fill his diner that day, showing that good decisions would be rewarded. The weekend brought more surprises. 2 local churches, one black and one white, announced they would hold a joint prayer service for community unity. Though some members objected, both churches were full that Sunday morning. As the sun set on their first week of organized action, the coalition met to review their progress. The photographs spread across the church basement tables told their story: dignified protesters, supportive students, changing business practices, and communities coming together. "This is just the beginning," Marcus Williams told the tired but hopeful group. "Change doesn't happen in a day, but it does happen. We're proving that right here." Outside, the summer evening glowed with possibility. The coalition's careful planning was working better than anyone had expected, but they knew the real challenges still lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities, and new chances to show that peaceful, organized resistance could change their town one day at a time. David Palmer from the Chicago Tribune hadn't planned to stop in Greenwood, Mississippi. He was on his way to New Orleans to cover a different story when his car broke down just outside of town. As he waited at Johnson's auto repair shop, he noticed something unusual: a steady stream of well-dressed black citizens walking past the shop, each carrying identical papers in their hands. Curious by nature, the young reporter struck up a conversation with Robert Williams, who was fixing his car. "Just a loose radiator hose," Robert explained, wiping his hands on a rag. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, "But if you want a real story, Mr. Palmer, I got something better than a broken-down car." Over the next hour, Robert showed Palmer their carefully documented evidence: Diana Thompson's detailed notes, Mr. Johnson's photographs, and the new Green Book of Greenwood. Palmer's hands shook with excitement as he reviewed the materials. This wasn't just a local dispute, this was history in the making. "What makes this different," Palmer wrote in his notebook, "is the organization, the dignity, the strategy." He had covered civil rights stories before, but something about Greenwood's approach felt new and powerful. The next morning, Palmer called his editor in Chicago. "Bob, I'm not coming to New Orleans," he said. "I found something bigger here in Mississippi." His editor wasn't happy about the change of plans, but Palmer insisted. "Trust me on this one." Palmer spent the next 3 days following the coalition's activities. He watched Dr. Robinson's peaceful protest outside Mason's Diner. He attended a strategy meeting at First Baptist Church. He interviewed white business owners who had chosen to serve all customers, and some who hadn't. What impressed him most was 12-year-old Michael Thompson's Safe Path project. "The children aren't just watching history," Palmer wrote. "They're helping to make it." His first article appeared in the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday morning. "Mississippi Town Shows New Path to Civil Rights." The story included photographs of dignified protesters, maps of Michael's safe paths, and quotes from both black and white community members. By Wednesday afternoon, other newspapers were calling. The Associated Press picked up the story, and suddenly Greenwood was national news. Television crews from Memphis and Jackson arrived in town, their large cameras drawing crowds on Main Street. Not everyone was happy about the attention. Mayor William Bedford called an emergency town council meeting. This kind of publicity could hurt business, he warned. But when the cameras turned to him for comment, he chose his words carefully. Greenwood is working through its challenges in its own way. The media attention brought unexpected supporters. A group of white college students from Michigan, who read Palmer's article, drove down to join the peaceful protests. They brought donations for the coalition's fund and new ideas for nonviolent resistance. Local white citizens who had stayed quiet began speaking up. Mrs. Anderson, who owned the town's fabric store, gave an interview to Palmer. "I've been serving all customers the same way for 30 years, she said proudly. "It's not just good morals, it's good business." The coalition handled the sudden attention with careful planning. Marcus Williams appointed Sarah Martinez as their media coordinator. She created information packets for reporters and made sure everyone stayed on message. This was about dignity, justice, and community. Palmer's follow-up articles focused on the economic impact. He interviewed Mr. George Thompson from the bank, who shared data showing how businesses that discriminated were losing money. "Integration isn't just right," the banker said, "it's profitable." The story spread beyond newspapers. A popular radio show in Detroit did a special report on Greenwood. A magazine photographer from New York arrived to do a photo essay. Each piece of coverage brought more attention and more support. Diana Thompson's phone started ringing with calls from other towns wanting to know how to organize their own coalitions. She and Emma Williams spent evenings making copies of their strategy documents to share. By the end of the week, Palmer had written 5 major articles about Greenwood, but his favorite story never made it to print. Watching Michael Thompson and his friend Tommy reunite at school, their friendship stronger than the forces trying to divide them. "What's happening in Greenwood?" Palmer wrote in his notebook late one night, "isn't just about restaurants. It's about a community choosing dignity over division, strategy over strife, and hope over hate, and the whole country is starting to notice." The morning everything changed in Greenwood started with a phone call to Mayor Bedford's office. Harrison Manufacturing, the town's largest employer, wanted an urgent meeting. Their vice president was flying in from Detroit that afternoon. The mayor's secretary noticed his hands trembling as he wrote down the details. By noon, the mayor's office was crowded with nervous town officials. Harrison Manufacturing employed over 500 people in their auto parts factory. They had been talking about expanding their Greenwood operation, which would bring another 200 jobs. Now suddenly, their vice president was coming to town. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Richard Harrison Jr. walked into the mayor's office. He carried that morning's Chicago Tribune, folded to show David Palmer's latest article about Greenwood. The room fell silent as he placed it on the mayor's desk. "Gentlemen," Harrison said, his voice firm but calm, "our company has a simple policy. We don't expand in towns with discrimination problems. It's bad for business, bad for workers, and bad for our company's reputation." The mayor started to explain, but Harrison wasn't finished. "We're not the only ones concerned," he continued. "Johnson Electronics called me this morning. They're thinking about canceling their plans to build here. That's another 100 jobs Greenwood might lose." Down the street, at the Chamber of Commerce, phones were ringing nonstop. 3 smaller companies had already called, asking questions about the situation. The chamber president, Tom Wilson, realized they had a crisis on their hands. Wilson called an emergency meeting for 4:00 p.m. As business owners filled the chamber's meeting room, they noticed something different. Marcus Williams and Diana Thompson were there, invited to present the coalition's evidence. Diana spread her documents across the conference table. Customer complaints, photographs, economic data from the bank, and letters from companies threatening to take their business elsewhere. The room grew quiet as business owners studied the materials. In the past 2 weeks, Diana explained, her teacher's voice clear and confident, businesses that serve all customers have seen their profits increase by 15%. Those that discriminate have lost an average of 22% of their business. Marcus Williams stood next to a large chart showing potential job losses if companies chose not to expand in Greenwood. "This isn't just about restaurants anymore," he said. "This is about our town's future." Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley's department store, spoke up first. His store had always served everyone, and his profits proved it was good business. "We need to fix this," he said, looking around the room. "Not next month, not next week, but today." The mayor wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. The room was cool, but he was sweating. Half the town worked at Harrison Manufacturing or hoped to work at the new Johnson Electronics plant. If those jobs disappeared, he knew who voters would blame. Martha Mason, who had been quiet until now, suddenly stood up. Her family owned Mason's Diner, where the trouble had started. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "We've been wronged," she said, her voice breaking. "My grandfather opened our diner in 1925. He always said good food and good business go together. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that." She turned to face Marcus and Diana. "I'd like to be the first to make this right. Mason's Diner will serve everyone, starting tonight. And," she paused, tears in her eyes, "we owe this community an apology." The room erupted in applause. Other business owners quickly followed. Johnson's Family Restaurant announced they would remove their reserved signs. Pete's Diner, which had already quietly started serving everyone, made it official. By 6:00 p.m., the Chamber of Commerce had drafted a new policy. All member businesses would serve all customers equally. Those who refused would lose their chamber membership and its benefits. Richard Harrison Jr. made one more stop before heading to the airport. He visited the coalition's office at First Baptist Church. "Keep doing what you're doing," he told them, shaking hands with Marcus Williams. "You're showing the whole country how change should happen." That evening, Mason's Diner served its first fully integrated dinner crowd. The Thompsons and Williamses sat at the counter, ordering their usual Sunday specials on a Thursday night. When Martha Mason brought out extra pie on the house, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. Sometimes, Marcus Williams said quietly to his wife Emma, "The biggest changes start with the smallest choices." He watched as Michael Thompson and Tommy shared a chocolate milkshake at the counter, just like they used to, while their parents talked and laughed together. The tide had turned in Greenwood, and there would be no going back. Friday morning dawned different in Greenwood. The sun rose over a town that had changed overnight. Mason's Diner's neon sign blinked cheerfully in the early morning light, and beneath it hung a new, hand-painted sign. "Welcome all. Come as you are." Inside the diner, Martha Mason had arrived early to talk with her staff. Some waitresses had threatened to quit when they heard about the new policy. She gathered them in the kitchen before opening. "Things are changing," she told them, her voice gentle but firm. "Those who want to be part of this change can stay. Those who don't should collect their final paycheck." To her relief, only 2 waitresses left. The others stayed, including Mary Beth, their longest-serving waitress, who smiled and said, "It's about time." By 7:00 a.m., the breakfast crowd started arriving. Black and white customers sat side by side at the counter, some awkward at first, but mostly hungry and focused on their coffee and eggs. Old habits began to break down over hot biscuits and morning conversation. Word spread quickly through the coalition's phone tree. Diana Thompson's phone rang nonstop as people shared their experiences. "I just had breakfast at Johnson's," one caller reported. "The service was perfect, just perfect." Another called about Pete's Diner. "They gave my little girl a free ice cream cone, just like they always did for white children." But not everything changed smoothly. Some white customers stopped coming to the integrated restaurants. A few left angry notes. Others made rude comments. But for every customer who left, 2 new ones seemed to appear. By lunchtime, something remarkable happened at Mason's. The diner was completely full, with a line out the door. Black and white families waited together, making small talk about the weather and their children's school activities. The cash register rang steadily all day. Other restaurant owners noticed. Tom's Cafe, which had been holding out, saw their empty tables and Mason's full ones. By dinner time, they too had changed their policy. Money talked, and it was speaking clearly. The local newspaper, which had ignored the story for weeks, finally ran a front-page article, "Local Restaurants Welcome All Customers." They interviewed Martha Mason, who spoke honestly about her change of heart. "I remembered something my father told me," she said in the interview. "He said the secret to good business is making people feel at home. All people, he meant. Though I didn't understand that then, I understand it now." The coalition organized thank you visits. Groups of black customers went to each restaurant that had changed its policy, ordered meals, and made a point of thanking the owners. They were polite, paid promptly, and left generous tips. It was another careful strategy that worked perfectly. Michael Thompson and Tommy's friendship bloomed again. They met for hamburgers after school, sitting at their old favorite booth in Mason's. Other young people followed their example. The kids, it seemed, adjusted more quickly than their parents. By Saturday night, 8 of the 10 restaurants that had started the trouble were now serving everyone. The 2 holdouts were struggling. Their parking lots sat empty while other restaurants flourished. The change brought unexpected moments of grace. At Johnson's Family Restaurant, an elderly white woman invited a black family to share her table when the place was full. At Pete's Diner, a black customer helped a white man who was choking, saving his life with the Heimlich maneuver. These stories spread through town, replacing old fears with new connections. Sunday brought the biggest test. After church, black families who had been turned away just weeks before returned to their favorite restaurants. Some came in their Sunday best, others in casual clothes, but all came with dignity. At Mason's Diner, Martha Mason worked the register herself. She greeted each customer by name, regardless of their color. When the Thompson family walked in, she stepped out from behind the counter. "Welcome back," she said, tears in her eyes. "Your usual table is waiting." Diana Thompson nodded, accepting the words for what they were, not just a greeting, but an apology, a new beginning. By Sunday evening, the coalition met to discuss the changes. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Marcus Williams reminded everyone that change takes time, that there would be good days and bad days ahead. "But today," he said, looking around the room, "today we saw what's possible when people choose to do what's right." Outside, the Sunday evening was peaceful. Through the windows of Mason's Diner, anyone passing by could see what progress looked like. Families sharing meals, children laughing together, and a community beginning to heal, one dinner at a time. 1 year after the restaurant protests began, Greenwood had become a different town. On a warm summer evening, the coalition gathered at First Baptist Church to celebrate their anniversary. The basement room, once filled with worry and determination, now buzzed with pride and achievement. Diana Thompson stood at the front, holding up her original notebook. Its pages were now yellow and worn, but the careful records had become part of Greenwood's history. The local library had asked to display it in a special exhibition about the town's journey toward equality. "Let me share some numbers," she announced to the packed room. In the past year, business revenue in Greenwood has increased by 35%. Harrison Manufacturing brought in 300 new jobs, not just the promised 200. Johnson Electronics built their new plant. But the real numbers aren't about money, they're about people. Marcus Williams took over, unfolding a large chart. 17 other towns have copied our methods, he said proudly. The Greenwood model, they're calling it. Peaceful change through organization, documentation, and economic pressure. Michael Thompson, now 13, sat with Tommy in the back row. They had started a youth group at their school called Building Bridges, which helped students from different backgrounds become friends. 25 students had joined in the first month. Now there were over 100 members. Martha Mason from Mason's Diner stood up to speak next. Her diner had become a symbol of change in Greenwood. "Our business is better than ever," she reported. "But more importantly, my grandfather would be proud. We're finally the community gathering place he always wanted us to be." The coalition had grown beyond restaurants. They now worked on other issues: job opportunities, education, and housing. Their careful methods and peaceful approach continued to work. When the town's largest factory needed new workers, the coalition helped ensure fair hiring practices. When the school board discussed building a new high school, they made sure it would serve all neighborhoods equally. Emma Williams started a program called Sharing Stories, where people from different backgrounds met for dinner in each other's homes. Breaking bread together breaks down barriers, she always said. Over 100 families had participated so far. The local newspaper, which had once ignored their struggle, now had a regular column called Community Progress, written by Sarah Martinez. She had discovered her talent for journalism while documenting the restaurant protests and was now studying to become a reporter. Mr. Johnson's photographs from the protests had been displayed at the State Museum. These pictures show how change should happen, the museum curator had said, not with violence, but with dignity and determination. David Palmer from the Chicago Tribune returned to Greenwood for the anniversary. He wrote a follow-up article titled "The Town That Changed Itself." National magazines picked up the story, and soon other communities were sending representatives to learn from Greenwood's example. During the celebration, Robert Williams shared an unexpected story. Last week, he said, a white family's car broke down outside my shop after closing time. A year ago, they might have been scared to accept help from a black mechanic at night. But they knew me from the protests. They'd seen how we handled ourselves. I fixed their car, and they invited my family to dinner this Sunday. The mayor, who had once worried about bad publicity, now bragged about Greenwood's progress to other city leaders. The Chamber of Commerce used the town's successful integration as a selling point to attract new businesses. Greenwood, their new slogan read, "A community that works together." As the evening wound down, 12-year-old Sarah Thompson, Michael's younger sister, asked to speak. She had started a school project interviewing people about their memories of the protests. "My teacher asked us what we want to be when we grow up," she said shyly. "I said I want to be like my parents and all of you. I want to help make things better." The room fell quiet. Her simple words captured what their movement had really accomplished. Not just changing policies or profits, but changing hearts and minds for the next generation. Marcus Williams closed the celebration with a prayer of thanksgiving, but he also reminded everyone that their work wasn't finished. "We've shown what's possible," he said. "Now we have to keep building on this foundation." As people left the church that evening, the streetlights illuminated a town forever changed. Mason's Diner's neon sign glowed in the distance, still blinking its welcome to all. Children of all races played together in the park across the street, and in windows throughout Greenwood, porch lights still blinked occasionally, no longer as a signal of resistance, but as a reminder of how far they'd come and how a community could change when people chose dignity over division.